Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and this week we're going to be getting weird once again with the Maxx number 8. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in May of 1994, we can see the front cover depicting exactly where we left off in the previous issue, with Maxx desperately clinging to the side of a cliff, hanging over a sea of rabid Izzes as Pitt stands above him, not necessarily understanding the danger as he is perceiving the sea of Izzes as a sea of Timmies. Story, art, Sam Keith. Swell dialogue, Bill Messner-Loebs. Finishes, Jim Sinclair. Lettering, Mike Heisler. Color, Steve Oliff and Ollie Optics. Logo, Chance Wolfe. Film output, Kella Graphics. The story picks up with us rejoining Sarah. This, of course, is after she has dropped off the quote-unquote talking block of clay that is, in fact, Mr. Gone in some unimaginable way that doesn't necessarily make sense as of yet, into Julie Winter's apartment. She is now taking the block of clay up on his advice, that being to listen to her spirit animal. The clay told her that her spirit animal was, in fact, a horse, so she is standing outside of a building with several animals protruding out of the side, notably a horse, a rhinoceros, a squirrel, and a moose. I wonder if the moose and squirrel are in some reference to Bullwinkle. I can imagine that that's something Sam might do, thinking that it was funny, but I have no way of verifying that. She's also questioning why on earth she's even following the clay's advice, because at this point, she's not certain if she's actually sane anymore. She's been conversing with a block of clay, and upon dropping off said block of clay into Julie Winter's apartment, she ran across Miniature Maxx and Miniature Pitt fighting an Izz in Julie's living room, which, by all accounts, seems rather impossible if you don't have any basis for exactly what's going on, which Sarah doesn't. So she now finds herself standing outside of this building, looking up at the horse, waiting for it to give her life advice. She then thinks to herself that she almost wishes her spirit animal were instead the squirrel, because at least then she'd be getting advice about the universe from the squirrel instead of a horse. Also, I'd like to point out that I'm not positive, but I'm wondering if this image that we see of the horse up close on the side of the building is perhaps a piece of artwork that Sam did before he made the Maxx. We've seen him do this in the past where he slips in pieces of art that he had from before this comic existed into the pages of this comic to utilize for the story. And given the level of very high detail on this image, along with some little tidbits of extra things that don't necessarily make sense, for instance, the face that seems to exist within the side of this building, it does seem to me that perhaps this may be one of those occasions where this was some sort of art piece he had done years prior to the existence of this comic and decided to use within its story and its pages. We are then teleported to the Outback, where we left off with Julie Winters being stalked by some sort of monster. Julie, realizing that she is being followed by a monster that means to do her harm, quickly acts and grabs a piece of stick from the large fertility stone and uses it like a spear, hurling it at the monster, impaling it, and killing it dead. As this is happening, Mini Mr. Gone notices that Julie is starting to revert to some of her Outback personality that she would have as the Leopard Queen, and decides that his best move is to try and skedaddle. As the creature breathes its last breath, Julie notices the miniature Mr. Gone and leaps through the air to grab him off the top of the fertility stone. She then lands and clutches the mini Mr. Gone in her hand as she screams, "I knew you weren't dead. I want to know the truth." He responds by saying, "Talk to Descartes, Toots." Now, that is in reference to the French philosopher / mathematician René Descartes, who, if you didn't know, like I didn't before I read this issue, is the man who came up with the phrase, "I think, therefore I am." Now, there's actually a lot of things going on in these two pages that we learn. Number one, Mr. Gone is not necessarily miniature. as we find out that the creature that was stalking Julie throughout all of these panels was a giant known as Malachi, and he was actually known as the greatest giant on the Outback, meaning that Julie, Pitt, and Maxx are all giant-sized. And I thought that perhaps maybe this was because these are the New York City versions of them in the Outback, meaning that when someone from the world that we live within goes to the Outback, they are giant-sized when they get there. This was also something I thought reinforced by the idea that the Outback Maxx, who has been existing in Julie's apartment fighting the was miniature. There's just one problem with that theory, and that's the fact that Pitt is giant-sized in the Outback, but miniature in Julie's apartment, and that's the same Pitt in both places at the exact same time, which kind of throws a wrench in my theory and is also very weird. And listen, folks, as I said at the beginning of this video, the Maxx is weird, and it ain't getting no less weird from here on out. And speaking of Julie's apartment, we then rejoin Pitt and Outback Maxx as they have successfully subdued the that has been chasing them all around the apartment, trying to eat the two of them. At this point, Pitt wants to try and figure out exactly what's going on as he is thoroughly confused by the situation. But before that happens, Outback Maxx wants to completely dispose of the and formulates a plan that he somehow talks Pitt into going along with. This plan apparently involves hanging the off of the coffee table out of the window of Julie's apartment, and then allowing Pitt to apparently cut the phone line that is tying the to the leg of the table so that he can drop to the street below and perish, I suppose. However, at this point, as Pitt starts to climb out of the window to do this, he does start to question this plan, even asking Maxx, hey, why is it that I'm out here supplying all the muscle and taking all the risk while you're inside the apartment? Maxx claims that he is steadying the table, and Pitt doesn't seem to necessarily buy it. However, he doesn't have time to dwell on this as the begins to wriggle itself free. Pitt states that he needs Maxx to hold the table, but Maxx wants to try and come and help Pitt. However, before Pitt can object to any of this, we see Maxx let go of the table, which drops it to the street below and launches Pitt through the air. Maxx notes that Pitt seemed angry about this, but is interrupted then when Julie once again calls out from the bathroom that she has in fact been trapped inside of this entire time. She asks for Maxx to come and save her, which he happily obliges to do as he crawls underneath the door to the bathroom. However, as he does this, his mask falls off, and Julie is then able to see his face. Upon seeing Max's face, Julie starts to panic as she says, You're a, oh my God. We also notice the block of clay, which is also Mr. Gone somehow being depicted in the closet of Julie's apartment. And I find it interesting that Julie is rather distraught at seeing Max's exposed face, but doesn't seem in any way caught off guard by the fact that he's only 6 inches tall. Meanwhile, back in the Outback, we see an image of a sea of picking all of the meat off of a giant clean down to the bone. We then see that Pitt has decided to pull Maxx up off the side of the cliff, apparently realizing that the were in fact not Timmy's, and that Maxx is rather glad for the help as he observes all of the chowing down. We also happen to notice the shadow of an air whale as it slowly approaches the two on the cliff. As it flies overhead, Maxx grabs onto one of the pectoral fins of the air whale and holds on as it flies away. Pitt tells Maxx that, hey, that's a pretty good idea. You're going to come back for me once you find help, right? Hey, Maxx, right? And then he simply realizes that Maxx is not going to come back at all and just screams out, damn you, Maxx, as he shakes his fists in anger. Now, I find this really interesting because, again, we see that New York Maxx is existing in the Outback as we saw Outback Maxx existing in New York. However, Pitt seems to be the same in both of these realities, which I don't know how is possible. And being that he doesn't have a specific Outback form the way that both Maxx and Julie Winters do, I'm kind of wondering what's going to happen to the pit of this existence in relation to the pit of New York City, as they seem to be the same individual existing on two different planes on the exact same timeline. We then rejoin Sarah in New York City as she has made her way up to a ledge on a nearby building, waiting for the horse to provide her with answers. However, she's beginning to grow impatient, noting that the horse has given her no insight or flashbacks. And at this point, she's starting to get frustrated and angry as she states, what kind of lame spirit animal are you anyway? I'm here listening for you to say something and you've given me nothing. And what if you do speak? What is this going to be? Some sort of life is great, get high on life, the same old crap the horses talk about. She then goes on to state that the only thing dumber than a talking granite horse is the girl who's looking to one for answers, as she starts to question whether or not she should even be here in the first place, which is only undermining everything that she's experienced thus far and really starting to put cracks in what she believes is objective reality. Now, there's a lot of things going on in these two pages. Number one, I really love the artwork that Sam uses on both of these pages. It's very surreal. However, I would like to note that on this page in particular, the building and ledge that Sarah is occupying here appears more so like a sheer cliff wall and some sort of boarded outcropping that she's sitting on all alone, with no logical way as to how she could have gotten here. However, when we look at this page, the silhouette does seem to suggest that this is in fact a brick and mortar building with a ledge on the side. Now, excusing the idea that somehow this teenage girl managed to get inside of a building and climb out onto the ledge of said building with literally none of the occupants inside questioning this in any way, it does sort of possibly suggest that she may be existing within the Outback and New York City at the same time, the way that we've been seeing Pitt do. Clearly, this does not seem to fit at all in the objective reality of New York City, but this over here does. So I am wondering if somehow this is happening to her and she's just not realizing it as of yet, or if this is not at all what she is seeing. This is something that we, the readers, are seeing, but she only perceives this rocky cliffside with the boarded ledge as the way it exists in New York City, with it being the side of a building with a ledge that goes to an open window. We then rejoin Julie Winters as she struggles to comprehend seeing Max's face. She asks Maxx if this has always been the case, or if this is the secret, why he was sent here. Is this some kind of awful joke? She then screams at Maxx to answer her as we see the image of the head of a rabbit. However, at this point, her mind becomes very sensitive and is bombarded with images. She realizes that she's still in the bathroom with the leering, long-eared creature, but also sees the images of the lamp, as well as water droplets over the black-blue surface of pain and blood. She then notices that she's in the exact same position as she was in the Outback, as she stands over the miniature Mr. Gone, still clutching him in her hand. She asks him, what are you doing to me? And he responds, I'm simply showing you the truth. There is a lot going on in these two pages. Number one, we see this image of the rabbit's head, and we also are given the implication that this might in fact be the first time that Julie has ever actually seen Max's face without the mask on. We also are very much given the implication that Julie is existing within the confines of her bathroom at the same time that she's existing on the plane of the Outback. And that while she has been moving freely through the world of the Outback, she has never actually left her bathroom either. We're also given very vague and obtuse clues as to something that has happened to Julie in her past, what with the lamp and the water droplets and the rabbit. And none of these seem to make a whole lot of sense right now, but they definitely play into some pretty big reveals much later on into the story. Julie then screams at Mr. Gone to stop what he's doing because it hurts. However, Mr. Gone asks her, isn't this what you wanted, to see it behind the mask? Julie asks him how he knew that and how he knows about everything. Mr. Gone goes on to explain that it's quite simple because he is projecting part of himself into the other world, and that in fact he's there right now listening. And this is how he knows that the outback is getting smaller and smaller while the city continues to grow. He explains to Julie that this happened as a result of her going and conversing with her other two selves yesterday, and that this has broken down the barrier between the worlds and has thrown everything out of balance. He then tells Julie that he can explain more, but she seems to have a nasty habit of cutting his head off when he does so. So he then goes on to ask, do you want to know why you're so afraid of wet blue? However, before he can finish that sentence, having had reached her limit, Julie raises her fist up and then in one fell swoop decapitates Mr. Gone once again. We then see her pant as she seems quite upset about everything that has just taken place, still clutching the headless body of Mr. Gone. We then see Julie, who is now still in the outback despite the fact that she's also somehow in her bathroom, clutching herself alone as she seems to be rather shaken both emotionally and mentally. A lot of things happening here in these 2 pages. Number one, we learn that the conversation Julie had with her other selves happened only the day before the events that have been taking place in issues number 7 and 8. Also, we see the imagery of Mr. Gone as the block of clay in Julie's apartment, and it is rather odd he would so freely offer up the idea that he's in her apartment right now, letting her know of his presence. We also see the imagery of the rabbit again, as well as the water droplets on the blackened surface. And we also note that Julie seems rather hesitant to truly hear the truth, even though she's always demanding those answers. Every time Mr. Gone gets seemingly close to telling her exactly what it is she's not seeing or not remembering, she immediately stops him from doing so, which would imply that whatever has caused her to have this mental block was incredibly traumatic, and she wants to know the answers but doesn't want to relive all of that trauma. And she's very conflicted as a character as to whether or not she truly wants to get to the bottom of everything, or if she wants to remain in this blissful ignorance, as it were, and have a more peaceful existence without those terrible memories. Sometime later, the air whale carrying Maxx flies above Julie as she sits atop of the fertility stone. Upon seeing this, Maxx lets go and wonders if he's actually been holding on to the strut of a Goodyear blimp for the last 15 miles. As he lands heavily upon the stone, he asks Julie, do you know how hard it is to catch an air whale going this direction? He then puts himself back to back with Julie and says, great, now we're stranded in the middle of unending wilderness. What do we do now? However, Julie simply responds by mocking him for complaining. At this point, though, the pair of them are suddenly snapped back to New York City as we see the two of them sitting atop of a mailbox in the same positions that they were atop of the fertility stone. Having lived through these type of events multiple times at this point, Maxx simply says, uh-oh. However, Julie is having a much harder time gaining her bearings as she looks around and says, oh God, please tell me I haven't been sitting on top of this mailbox for God knows how long, looking like a complete idiot. We then see Sarah happen upon the two of them as she asks Julie what exactly she's doing on top of the mailbox. However, Sarah quickly realizes that Julie is out of sorts and starts to comfort her and tell her that she's going to get her home safely. Julie tells Sarah that she's starting to forget all of it as we see Maxx looking down at a child who is quite is-shaped, which would imply that maybe this child is in fact and is in disguise, as Maxx states, what are you looking at, kid? As we see Julie struggle to walk, Sarah continues to give her support as Julie states, I'm pretty certain I killed someone. Sarah says, yeah, sure you did, but when you're feeling better, why don't I tell you about this horse? However, Julie tries to respond stating, no, it wasn't a horse, it was something else. However, Sarah tells her to simply be calm as they continue to make their way back to Julie's apartment. As they get to the base of the building that houses Julie's apartment, Julie notices her ottoman smashed on the sidewalk. She asks Sarah, hey, is that my ottoman? Sarah tells her it is, and Julie then asks, "It's not supposed to be there, is it?" And Sarah tells her no, it isn't, as Julie simply says, "Oh God, what a day," as we see Maxx following behind. Now, this is quite interesting as we saw the two of the main protagonists of this story, that being Maxx and Julie, sitting alone together in the outback, and then suddenly snap back to the city streets of NYC, which would imply again that they can exist as these forms in both worlds at the exact same time and not necessarily be snapping back and forth between their outback selves and their New York City selves. We also notice that Sarah, while she's been dealing with a lot of things on her own, is also very cognizant of whatever mental event that she perceives Julie to be going through at this point, and immediately starts to try and console and help her through this instead of ignoring it or writing it off as Julie acting crazy. And this speaks a lot of volumes to Sarah's character as, you know, yes, she's dealing with tons of her own mental baggage, but when she sees someone else who's also seemingly struggling with a lot of the same things, she immediately puts all of her problems to the side and tries to help that person. And this is brought to an even higher level when you consider the idea that Sarah and Julie are not exactly that close. Keep in mind, as we've seen them in the past, Sarah tends to write off Julie as being very much living in an altered reality or in a very dishonest state with herself. And she was very much always questioning Julie and the way she lived, to her face, in fact, but seemingly also cares very deeply for Julie in this moment, which is rather interesting to see, especially considering this is not the type of behavior that we've seen Sarah exhibit up until this point. Maxx and Julie finally make their way back inside of Julie's apartment as Julie seems to be getting her bearings back at this point. She tells Maxx that Sarah sure is a nice kid, but God, something really smells inside of this apartment. Maxx then asks Julie, how much do you figure of that was all true? Julie responds by telling him that at least one of the pits, maybe the is, I don't know. She then asks Maxx how much he can remember. Maxx tells her some enough, but does she actually think that Gone was lying? Julie tells Maxx that she's positive that Gone was telling the truth about one thing, and that's the fact that he's definitely in this apartment somewhere, and that she can feel his presence somewhere. Maxx then says, yeah, I guess so, but God, where is that smell coming from, as we see the final panel showing a close-up of the quote-unquote block of clay in Julie's closet. We then get to the Maxx Tracks letter column, which has multiple reader-submitted letters, but also some artwork, notably this of an Is wearing Maxx boots. That's pretty funny. And we also see one down here of Outback Maxx fighting off an army of Ises. We then get 2 more pages of letters along with some more reader-submitted artwork. One of Maxx is a Pez dispenser. This is because one of the letters told Sam that they really wanted to see a Maxx Pez dispenser. One of Maxx in the dead end of a hallway. This one looks really cool. Another of Outback Maxx having just killed something, roasting it over an open fire with his bare hand. Really well done right here. One down here that's pretty funny. It's of Maxx as a ballerina. That one's amusing for sure. And this other one here that's just a standard image, per se, of Maxx kind of just loafing about. There were only a couple of letters that I found really interesting in this issue, one of which being where someone asked exactly what the idea was behind Sam making the miniature Maxx and miniature Pit. And Sam goes on to explain that this was actually a concept idea that he had while working at Marvel that he wanted to use for the Incredible Hulk. However, the editor at Marvel shot the idea down because he told Sam that they had already done a story with a mini Hulk earlier in the year, and he didn't want to be repetitious, and basically just told Sam that this was a no-go, that it was not going to fly, they weren't going to do this story. And so Sam decided that now that he was in charge of his own comic book, he was going to use that premise. On the final page of the letter column, we get the backside of the lumbering Maxx image that we saw on the previous page. And I like the idea that Sam wrapped this around the outside of the page instead of cutting it between the middle of two pages. That was a unique idea. We then get a stick figure Maxx, as well as a short, stumpy Maxx who is simply screaming out, "Print this, Sam," which he does, which is kind of funny. The other letter that I found rather interesting in this letter column was one from a 14-year-old boy who wrote in asking a bunch of questions he had and theories that he had about the story thus far. And I gotta hand it to this kid. He really gets a lot of it right. It is surprising how on the nose he was with some of his theories about what was actually happening in the story. I'm not going to bring any of them up directly in this episode because I don't want to give any like premature spoilers for those of you who have never read this story all the way through. But man, this kid super nails it. I got to give this kid a lot of credit for what he figured out. And on the final page of the letter column, we get a listing of some of Sam's favorite artists that favorite artist and, as he puts it, most influential artists in terms of his style and his drive to become an artist himself. Notably, Frank Frazetta, Bernie Wrightson, Arthur Sudam, I think is maybe how you say that. I'm not certain. Arthur worked a lot for a heavy metal magazine. And Vaughn Bode. He then goes on to state at the bottom of this page that without these guys, he'd be gum on our shoes, which is quite the praise coming from Sam, as he's basically shouting out these four artists as being highly influential in where he was at this point in his life, and for him to even take the plunge to go down the path that he would need to go down to become a professional artist who worked on a comic book series. We then get a full page splash of a piece of artwork by one James L. I don't know who James L. is, but this is a really cool image. I really like this a lot. And then an advertisement for the Image Fan Club. I don't know if the Image Fan Club still exists. However, at this time, it cost $15 to join, and you did get this pretty cool t-shirt. So really, you're at least just paying for the cost of the t-shirt and then also getting whatever fan club info that came along with being a member of the Image Fan Club. If you are watching this and happened to be a member of the Image Fan Club all the way back in 1994, let us know in the comments exactly what that entailed, like what you got for being a member of the fan club outside of just this t-shirt. We then get an advertisement for Shadowhawk Gallery. I'm not certain if I have this or not. I'm going to have to dig through my comic collection to see. If I do, I'll make a video about it. If I don't, I'll keep an eye out for it. But rest assured, I'm going to do my best to make sure that I can feature Shadowhawk Gallery on the channel at some point. And then we get an advertisement for Codename Strikeforce. If you would like to know more about Codename Strikeforce, you can check out my Codename Strikeforce playlist right here on the channel. We then get an advertisement / mail away form for some Maxx t-shirts from Graffiti Designs. I would absolutely buy both of these t-shirts were I not 30 plus years too late to do so. And on the next page, we get an advertisement for Brian Houghton's The Outer World. This was featured in the pages of Pit number 5. If you'd like to check out The Outer World, you can watch my video on Pit number 5, which you can find in my Pit playlist. We then get an advertisement for Maxx ash cans for issues number 1, 2, and 3. And God, have these ever been eluding me forever. I want these ash cans so bad. And they're really difficult to find, at least in my experience, especially if you're trying to get every color variant of the cover. There's like 6 or 7 different color variants for these ash cans. And I don't own any of them, and I want to own all of them, which unfortunately is going to be very difficult in my experience and probably quite expensive. We then get an advertisement for Killcat as he invades the pages of Freak Force. If you're watching this as it's being published, I have not yet reached the point in the Savage Dragon story that Freak Force breaks off into its own ongoing monthly series. But rest assured that when I reach that point, I will begin making Freak Force videos, as I have the entire series, and honestly, I really like it. So I really am kind of like on my tiptoes, can't wait in excitement about making Freak Force videos. On the final page of the book, we get an advertisement for Todd McFarlane's Spawn. If you'd like to know more about Spawn, feel free to check out my Spawn playlist. And on the reverse inside cover, we get an advertisement for Pit number 5. What I find interesting about this advertisement is that while it is for Pit number 5, the image that Dale Keown gave him to use for this ad was of an interior panel and not the cover. I would have thought for sure that he would have given him a black and white of the cover of the issue rather than an interior panel. But then again, maybe this was something that Dale had lying around, or perhaps he hadn't even finished the cover at this point. So there's a lot of reasons why this might be the case, but it is in fact the case. And if you'd like to know more about Pit, you can check out my Pit playlist. And that was the Maxx number 8. And despite the fact that it's incredibly weird, I really like this issue. Now, I have to admit, I am at a bit of an advantage because I have read this entire series and I know where it winds up. So I actually understand these very secretive and mysterious and obtuse clues that are being given about the storylines that involve both Julie, her past, Sarah, her spirit animal, the goings on between New York City and the Outback. I know how all this plays out, so I have to admit that I am very much biased in terms of my opinions of this single issue. If you look at this issue by itself, it is really weird. It is very difficult to follow, and that's by design. Sam was working on a very slow burn with the story of the Maxx, and that was one of the things he was actually very distraught about when he was making this comic book, as I've read. He very much questioned if he was making the comic book too mysterious and too weird, and if it was too difficult for the average reader to follow. And for some people, it probably was, but when you're going to take a chance with a character as out there as the Maxx, and with a book that has a story that's so different from anything else on the shelves, especially back in 1994, or even, the year prior when it started, you're going to alienate some people, and unfortunately that just goes along with the territory. However, for those who stuck around and followed this story all the way through, I ultimately think they really got rewarded for their patience, as much of this story is beautifully written, even if it does end in a very, I guess I would say, dissatisfying manner, especially if you had expectations about the way the story was going to end versus the way that it did. But overall, my experience with the Maxx is one of joy and fond memories, and I very much appreciate what Sam did with this title. And looking back at this now, especially this being the first episode I'm recording about the Maxx since Sam has passed, it really reinvigorates my appreciation for what he did with this book. But then again, these are just my opinions. Your opinions may be completely different. You might have thought that this issue wasn't that weird and that everything played out perfectly and made sense, or you might think that the Maxx as a whole is really just too out there for you and something that doesn't really resonate with your taste. And if that's the case, it's okay, because everyone's entitled to their own opinion. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.